Hello everybody. Today we are going to talk about some basics of working with paint on ceramic sculpture. So here's a sculpture of mine that I've painted over about 50 times at this point, and I have spray painted it black. This is a technique I highly recommend with sculpture because if you think about shadows, so if you think about my mouth, my nostrils, the areas around my eyes, underneath here, there's a lot of shadow in those places. So to make something really look 3D, if you start with a layer of spray painting a dark color, in this case I did black, you can basically give a little bit more depth as you add light spots. For instance, right now, just because of the shine of the spray paint, you're seeing some areas catch glow, and that's similar to how it is in real life. My cheekbone catches a little bit of light, just like you're seeing on this sculpture here. So the areas that get more light are a lot lighter, and that's why it's nice to start with this dark color. The nice thing about choosing paint with sculpture is that when you put it on, it looks exactly like that afterwards. It doesn't have to go through the kiln. You don't have to guess what color it will turn out like. I think the harder part with paint is you have so many more choices with how you layer and apply the paint, so it sometimes can be a little overwhelming. We're gonna start with some basics of color mixing. So I have most colors here. I didn't grab green, but I just wanna talk about the color wheel quickly. So color wheel, we start with our yellow, we have our red. If you notice, I have a warm red, which is kind of orangey, and a cool red, which is kind of a little bit more blue or purple. A lot of times you can take a little cool and warm and put them together and get more of a natural red color. And then the last color at the beginning of the color wheel is blue. If you notice, I'm putting those in a triangle. Primary colors cannot be mixed, so I can't take green and another color and mix yellow, but I can take yellow and blue and mix green. So now, in between the yellow and blue, if I take a little bit of yellow, a little bit of green, mix them together, you see I'm getting that green color. I'm sorry, a little bit of yellow, a little bit of blue makes green. In the same way, if I take my red and I take my blue and I mix them together, I get purple. If I take my red and I take my yellow and I mix them together, you get some orange. So those are the basics. Anytime you're given the option of using paint, take advantage of the fact that you have more than just the colors that come out of the bottle. A lot of times the basic colors are just that, they're super basic. So there are ways to elevate your work and make it a lot more interesting. For instance, if I want to use red, I could add a tiny bit of brown to my red, and then it becomes a little bit more earthy, right? I could take and add a little bit of white to my red, and then it becomes a little bit lighter. I could take a little black to my red, and then it becomes a little bit darker. I could take a little blue, and then it becomes cooler. And so using those colors in the way that you can blend is really, really helpful. Keep in mind, most of you did sculptures that somehow reference human. You don't necessarily need the human to have whatever skin tone you have to get us to see human. There's a lot of symbols in it already. So sometimes using color, you can do some really interesting things with it to kind of express your emotion or express the feeling. So I recommend for this technique, starting with that dark color like I showed, and then I'm gonna do some dry brushing and show you what that looks like. So with dry brushing, I'm gonna use a really, really dry brush here, okay? And the point of this is I wanna put on just a tiny bit of paint so the black shows through. So I'll turn this once again so you can see. I'm gonna start with a really light color. So I'm putting just the smallest amount of white on my bristles, and I think I'm gonna add a tiny bit of yellow too. So there's just a tiny bit of paint. I'm also going to use the extra place on my palette paper to wipe some of it off. So I want very little paint on this paintbrush. Now watch what happens when I just take and simply apply a little bit onto the face. If you're an expert with makeup, maybe this part looks a little familiar to you. But if you notice, it's starting to highlight the lighter parts, the parts that are hit by the light. So if I go back and grab a little more, I'll move over to this side and I'll do the same thing. So all of a sudden, that face, I'm highlighting the parts that would be lighter and I'm leaving parts of it darker. So that's just with one color. It's got a little bit of yellow, a little bit of white in it. Let's say I want to continue with some warm tones. I want it to kind of feel skin tone-esque. So I'm going for something in a brown range. I might take a little bit of orange, might take a little bit of brown, and maybe I'll go back and take a little bit of the yellow color that I started with before. So now I'm getting something in a brownish tan tone, and I might go and apply a little bit more on the surface. This is adding just a little more depth to the piece because I'm adding a little bit more color, okay? If I want something that's a little more solid, because right now this is still very, very dark, I can go in and try and be a little more forceful with pushing the color into the spaces. But because this technique is called the dry brush technique, I do really want to maintain that my brush is pretty dry. I don't want to add a lot of extra paint to it. Every time I should look at the bristles and not see a lot of extra paint. Okay, so now I'm gonna go and try and add a little more bold color to show you what that looks like. And you might decide you like this technique in some places, but you might decide for the eye you really want it to be solid, or the lips you really want it to be solid. You also can kind of change things from one side to the other. So I'm getting an orange vibe on this side. Maybe I want to keep it really light and more white on the other side. And so I can kind of push the color over here. Okay, so people are still going to look at this and they're gonna see the human form, even if you don't have a very, very solid coat in front of you. And maybe just as a highlight, I wanna go back with a tiny bit of green, so I mixed a little blue in, and maybe I'll put a little bit of that on the surface too, even on that orange side. Okay, it's a quick way to apply color and kind of make some interest in your piece. If you wanna go more solid with your color, you can totally do that too. I recommend using a larger brush, and if you wanna keep a consistent color throughout, you probably wanna spend some time mixing a bunch of that color. I still recommend doing this undercoat, so doing a small amount of black underneath. And then when you get your brush a little more full of your pigment, you can start to apply it. And that way, if you miss spots, they're not gonna look like white spots. Instead, they're gonna look like they were on purpose left in this dark shade. Because white spots, we all know, it makes it look like the piece was incomplete. Okay, so here you're seeing I'm getting a much more solid coat. I'll just do a tiny bit more so you can see. Remember, paint, we're not putting it back in the kiln, so you don't need to revisit it again. But once I have this solid coat on everything, maybe then I wanna go, because it's kind of making it a little more flat than the other side, maybe then I wanna go and add a little white to the color I had and kind of brighten up some areas just to give a little bit more depth, okay? As a final thought, you can always do other things on top of the work that you've already done. So my dry brush side has been drying for a bit. Maybe I wanna do something that's more precise. So I'm gonna take my white and my yellow, make more of a solid coat, and maybe I wanna do things like draw or write, right? So you can do all of those details over the top of your piece to really make it come to life. You can even add a little water to make sure it's blended really well. Okay, so these are just some examples of things that you can do on your own piece. Remember, this is a work of sculpture, so it's most important that you get your idea, get the feeling across, and whatever you have to do to get there, you know, paint is a great way to do it. I hope this was helpful, and I look forward to seeing your finished sculptures.